I think that's where we are heading, to this kind of, integrated, super intelligent platform that we'll all have. Our private AI filled with sensors that will kind of have a mild oversee of our lives and help us to lead those lives better.
Welcome to the Research4Good podcast. My name is David Ellis and I'm joined today by Dr Lukasz Piwek, who is an associate professor in data science. Lukasz is a truly interdisciplinary researcher in that he's published across psychology, computer science and media studies. His work mainly concerns how the data that we generate every day from our smartphones to when we visit the doctor can be used for social good, and also how we can avoid social harm. So great to see you again, Lukasz.
Great to be here, David. Thank you for having me.
I wonder if you could start by just telling me a bit about how you've ended up at the University of Bath.
Sure. So I was always fascinated with technology when I was already a small kid. Science fiction novels, philosophers who are writing about different futuristic perspectives of the reality. And then suddenly when I ended in doing PhD at Glasgow University, at that time digital technology was already emerging in this sort of phenomena, a wave that we are experiencing right now, a revolution you can say, where it became a force connected heavily to every aspect of our daily life and existence. And I was increasingly more fascinated by this potential and by also an attempt to understand human interaction with those digital devices, but also the way where we could use it to understand individuals and population as a sort of a source of data, as a source of information.
A lot of your work involves using digital traces directly or trying to understand the impact of those digital traces. Could you just say a little bit about what a digital trace is?
A digital trace is like a footprint, as like a small invisible digital footprint that we leave behind whenever we use any digital device. So listeners who are now listening to this podcast, you do it in your smartphone or in your desktop, you are probably right now recording a lot of this kind of digital traces with your activity, browsing, maybe internet at the same time, or checking something else on your smartphone. Each of those small actions that you do on your smartphone or your desktop or with any other device creates this tiny fingerprint of a data that is recorded and records this specific activity in a different way. And well, that's really what we kind of refer in the very principle to the digital trace as a sort of any digital recorded action that we can somehow quantify or capture.
You do a lot of work with digital traces and the data that we all generate every day, whether that's from our phone or from our smartwatch or from when we go to the doctor. Why is that so important to you to study? Of all the things you could study, why does that matter?
I guess it matters for me mainly because I perceive this as this sort of second layer to our reality, in a sense that is almost completely integrated with our world. I mean, it almost gets philosophical at this stage, David. So I'll digress a bit into this point. And bring Marshall McLuhan, who is an American philosopher from 60s, 70s, and he came up with this notion that technology is an extension of man. And he meant this in a very literal way. So he was talking about video camera being an extension of an eye and memory in capturing images and the reality that surrounds us in a way that eye can't really capture and the memory can't quite record and retrieve. He was talking about the car as being an extension of our mobility and our ability to move between places. Again, almost in the physical sense, it's a device that sort of extends our way of moving around the world. So I'm thinking about smartphones, wearable technology, all those digital innovations in a very similar way to how McLuhan was positioning it. And for me, it's inseparable now with the way we are living. And because I'm interested in human behavior, in behavior of individuals, society, how we can get to the point where we are more productive, healthier, happier, and generally sort of living a more constructive life. And I believe in this sense that technology is here to reinforce this, to help us in this process, to work not against us really, but as a thing that can support our attempts and our goals towards those particular areas.
Thinking a bit more broadly, why does it matter to people who might be listening to this or members of the public?
It's because we all use it. We are all so heavily connected with this, and we are all interested how it impacts us. Almost on a daily basis, you hear reports in media of how computer games are affecting our children, how smartphones are having an impact on our productivity. But are we actually certain about this? Do we know those things? We are just scratching the surface. We still don't quite know yet how this actually impacts us. What are the potential to help? Let's say taking a computer games example, because it's a very controversial space right now. There are a lot of voices that are arguing for a negative impact. However, in terms of a strong empirical evidence, we both know that a lot of it is quite anecdotal, based on the self-reports, and not on this kind of solid, hard data collection that actually looks at human behavior, that observes how people are using it, what the data tells us about their way they, let's say, use games or play games, or kind of how the game play part in their daily life. And again, I'm taking game as an example, but it applies to almost any digital extension that we use in our daily life, from streaming Netflix to watching to using a wearable tracker to track your fitness performance or your heart rate.
It's almost impossible to escape it, as you say.
Yeah.
And there are all these benefits that you touch on there, or things that we need to understand because they affect so many people.
Yes.
But there's also the potential for this technology to cause some harm in ways that we do know a bit more about. So things like misinformation or disinformation online,
yes.
Cyberbullying. Some of your work also speaks to that as well.
That's right. Yes. So a lot of some of the research projects have been kind of moving around understanding communities and individuals who are somehow reinforcing disinformation or polarized views. So that kind of relates more to my security or cybersecurity strand of work that we do as a part of the Center of Research and Evidence for Security Threats, where School of Management is connected to this project. So that's, again, a huge multidisciplinary attempt to understand those security risks that emerge from the use of digital technologies and us being online, communicating online, using Twitter, Facebook to share, to disseminate a lot of very private information. But also, of course, the aspect that you touched on, disinformation, how it spreads, why it spreads faster than actual real information. We're still scratching the surface of understanding kind of psychology behind this. And again, of course, this big data, the digital domain, offers us potentially a window to examine, to understand those mechanisms.
The why is a really interesting question sometimes, in terms of why do people play games, why do people spread misinformation? And it's an area where we don't often have as much to say.
One of the projects we've been doing recently, we were trying to understand this broader phenomenon of political or conceptual polarizations when people shift from being neutral or indifferent on the topic, let's say, to being kind of more extreme, or they shift from kind of more left-wing political views to the right-wing, or from more light right-wing views to more extreme right-wing views. And we've been trying to, again, understand sort of more psychological mechanism that fuels the polarization online in the context of disinformation, political events, and so forth. And in here, we look at the tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of data points from hundreds of thousands of individuals on Twitter. Of course, human observer can't just visually look qualitatively through this data. That's where those machine learning methods are so useful and powerful to help us extract some patterns. However, we still need to look at the results of those algorithms to see if they are actually make sense, if they do the job in the right way, if the decision of the algorithm is not in a way dangerous or biased in some particular direction.
Presumably you also need to check, like the people behind the tweets are real people, hopefully.
Yeah.
You're only getting one part of them from the tweet, presumably. So there's still room to go and ask, find these people and ask them questions, right?
Of course. And this, what we call the ground truth aspect. So, yeah.
This must raise ethical challenges as well, because when we think about informed consent to take part in psychological studies, we ask people, do you want to take part? And we sort of tell them what's going to happen. Whereas when people are on Twitter and Facebook or engaging with other digital services, we're sometimes using their data, but we haven't necessarily got their consent. It's an interesting area to be in at the moment.
That's right. So this aspect is also transforming very heavily, and it's been transforming, let's say, in the scope of the last 6-7 years. Also in the light of some of the controversies that emerged in the recent years related to a kind of employing data scraping techniques and machine learning with the social media profiling I'm referring here to the Cambridge Analytica scandal primarily. Just to recall, Cambridge Analytica scandal from around 2015-16 was when a huge amount of data was collected from Facebook without this being authorized by the users, so without user authorization or consent, and used for specific type of political profiling. At that time, it was around the kind of a Brexit voting and US election, but there are allegedly some other cases when this has been, when Cambridge Analytica misused users' data. It's a kind of very delicate balance, because clearly we want to have access to some particular personal data sometimes that individuals are posting, because that gives us more context of what they are posting and how they are engaging, who they are in general. However, of course, in the framework of GDPR or some of those regulatory governmental EU and UK frameworks that have been published, collection of some of this data can be problematic. On the other hand, the social media companies are also restricting some of the access, not necessarily including academic work as a part of this. So we are in quite a pickle here at the moment in many cases.
We're surrounded by technology. It's in the news all the time. Every day there's a press story about technology's ruined my child's life, or it's enabled something that couldn't have ever possibly happened that's very socially good. How does your work fit into this?
You're absolutely right that technology gets a lot of bad press these days. And I guess my goal is clearly to find this positive sides and focus on how we can bring the benefit, understand, of course, the negative impacts of digital technology solutions, and sort of appreciate it, mitigate it. However, philosophically, my key focus is on those positive themes of how we can use technology to make humans happier, more productive, more healthy, and generally more satisfied with the activity. Supports those different strands. So the domains I'm looking at are primarily around security and health, but we're looking at aspects related to political misinformation. We're looking at the workplace productivity. There are sort of broad themes that overlap in almost in different areas here.
So if we just unpack that a little bit, so if we take something like health, there's lots of technologies that that claim to make us healthier. There's so many smartphone apps that will say it will make me happier. There's my wearable device that tells me to walk further. Is that some of the areas that your work's touching on?
That's right. I'm very much interested in the consumer technologies and how they could potentially be implemented into regular healthcare. What's the principle here? Let's kind of talk a bit about this sort of slightly futuristic scenario. In this article we published in 2016, we talk about this notion of predictive preventive diagnostics. This idea that people will have specific devices on their bodies, whether they are smartwatches or smart rings or clothing or necklaces, that will monitor specific physiological parameters such as heart rate, their level of movement, their level of stress. And then smart algorithms collect this data and monitor continuously these particular data points in the context of a known health norms that we are familiar with from the healthcare, but also within this individual profile. So we're getting this kind of continuous data stream that is collected, as well as the AI that looks after this data and kind of in the right moment comes in and nudges you and tells you a small story, telling you, let's say that, your levels of physical activity are a bit low, or it noticed some kind of irregularity in your typical resting heart rates. And again, there are already first symptoms that this kind of solutions are appearing. For example, Apple Watch they do a lot of work in Apple to try to implement kind of more sophisticated sensors and almost medical grade technology into a sort of a consumer wearable Apple Watch. So that's a kind of this predictive component where when you have the data and you have an algorithm that can gradually start predicting if something will happen with your health in the future. And that, of course, brings us into the prevention, that the AI would be almost like your smart health consultant that would be sort of attached to your personal health profile and could give you a small nudges or advices towards the kind of positive direction, how you could change. And of course, when things would be uncertain, the healthcare professional would still have maybe access and evaluate this, but you could make some of the more sort of settled decisions yourself. So that's, I think, kind of one of this bigger picture or bigger goals which I perceive with this technology that I think we would try to work towards envisioning.
And that's the potential of this kind of utopia.
That's right.
But some people listening to that, they would have caused them panic or concern.
I appreciate it.
Can you see where it could go very wrong?
Of course. I recognize this health data in any form is a very private data. We can clearly see pathways of how this could be used in malicious way to target individuals with let's take an insurance policy, and if the insurer have an access to this type of information that can already start adjusting premiums based on health profile, which would be a very controversial aspect. Same would go to that's I think sort of one example of this. The potential of data leaks would be much more profound because of the detail that would be potentially embedded in this type of information. And of course, because this would be clearly quite complex system, and we recognize the complexity of implementing something like this with an existing healthcare systems or providers. There are potentially a lot of points where this could go wrong, and it needs to be planned carefully, done with a lot of preliminary studies and controlled pilots to understand the consequences, the pathway of the users.
So is it fair to say then that a lot of your work is actually trying to sort of envision these problems before they arise?
Yes. In a way, that's sort of one definitely one aspect that I would very much like to do, to try to identify some of those issues before they emerge and become kind of more critical, real problem.
And let's assume that you solve all these issues and what you've just described is a reality, which to some degree is, as you said before, it's sort of happening slowly already.
Yes.
As a psychologist, though, do you not feel that it's still very much reliant on people, regardless? Because my watch tells me to move more, but it's up to me whether I move or not.
Absolutely, David, and I like this analogy that one of my colleagues used, that it's not sufficient to just give people a scale, right, a weight scale, and expect them to lose weight. It doesn't work like this. If you just give them a smartwatch and expect them to count more steps, it frequently is not really working. And of course, our own kind of small-scale validation studies, as well as work has been done by other research team, is a testament to it. Frequently, when people get those devices, there is a short-term positive effect, but the long-term effects are much more doubtful and vague and not really clear. Another thing is that there are very specific demographic groups that are frequently signing up and using those devices. professionals who are generally interested in the tech have potentially a material means to access this type of technologies, especially if they are newer, cutting edge, well-known brands. So there are clearly those kind of human-oriented or sort of human-centric challenges that are the most critical, and that's why psychology is actually so essential in this process. Because you're right, I kind of focus maybe a bit more on the sort of data side and the benefit that comes from this, but I see behavioral sciences and psychology as being absolutely critical in this process of understanding our usage of technology and our interaction with technology, because this interaction itself is extremely complex, and we already know this. That it's not just this simple putting it on your wrist and, clicking notifications and sort of counting the goals. Your personality, your general habits and goals, where you are, what's your kind of material and demographic status, all those kind of circumstances and components are coming together to actually impact your way of using the tech.
And of course, those things sit within society as well,
yes.
Which is another level up. So again, not to dismiss the utopia of what could be, but you've already sort of alluded to it, where these technologies are often not coming equally to society, and the people who perhaps need them more are not actually having access to them.
Absolutely, yes. On this point, of course, it has to be said that digital devices are becoming increasingly a commodity. They are so cheap that even some of the countries around the world, populations that are underprivileged in terms of their socio-demographic status or location, frequently they can have access to newer smartphones and digital tech before they have access to more essential services, because of the way it became in terms of the evolution of digital tech. And I observed it firsthand when I was traveling in Laos and Myanmar, and I was quite interested at that time. And when I was sort of traveling in more remote areas, you could see individuals who had newest Android smartphones, but there was, let's say, no proper sanitation or access to water in the particular village where you had this. So that was sort of this quite interesting, the way how this digital technology kind of took over.
That raises a really interesting question about priorities. You've just raised the fact that people have got smartphones before they have running water.
Yeah.
I mean, I could ask a question now about, well, why should we be funding more work on digital technology when we can't even get water to certain countries in the world? Is there a danger that balance has to be kept? I'm just curious to know what your response is to that.
Sure. I think that Africa is a good example where technology is really empowering communities to in resolving some of those more fundamental issues related to access to the basic needs, and of course they provided also capabilities of communicating in a crisis, in war zones, all this sort of factors that were. Yeah, I think your point is absolutely valid. I just think it's because of the nature of how digital technologies has expanded in late 21st century. Is the way it became embedded in the reality that's why it's kind of got there before some of those more essential services that might be maybe even sort of from a practical perspective more difficult to implement in some of those societies. While those solutions are easier to implement. And then, of course, by this, they also are quickly opening a lot of potential for positive changes in those societies.
What about your hopes for the future? What do you think's going to happen? I mean, it's like the $1 million question of, what's next? What do you think is next?
Yeah, it's $1 million and good question. I mean, I think that, again, what I said earlier, my sort of core philosophy stems also a lot from a science fiction novel that I read about this kind of near future scenarios. William Gibson comes to my mind, Neil Stephenson, those kind of cyberpunk, sci-fi, dystopian novels that were describing, they were writing them in sort of 80s and describing a digital reality of the future. Well, we are now reaching this point of this reality. And in a way, those are kind of some of the scenarios that I look back at those novels are now fulfilling. What are the core components for me from this? The first one is what Kevin Kelly, another philosopher who is also a chief editor of Wired magazine, used to be chief editor of Wired magazine. He talks about this sort of phenomena called cognification, how reality and our lives become increasingly smartified by the digital devices that we connect. Alexa, Siri, all those smart assistants, Internet of Things, as well as, of course, all these other digital extensions that I mentioned earlier, social networks, all the smartphone apps. All those elements collect data, and in a way, gradually it becomes this kind of, again, another term, a digital twin that exists within our own life. That's our own digital twin that exists, this kind of a copy of our life that exists, a copy of our behavior in a way that exists in this data space that tells a really complex stories about individuals and population behavior. In the future, I think that the key aspect is integrating those different strains in a way that it's secured and safe, so that consumers and users, people, have a confidence and trust in those systems and in technology. Because right now we're at a point when people still don't have a trust, that there is strong resistance towards those solutions. So building this trust requires better security and building better confidence for the customers that they have a control there, that they have a control over how their data is managed, stored, used. So that's the first very much component. We need companies and governments, as well as us, need to regain this trust in technology and in the way it's applied. And the second is literally just sort of merging this in a smart, simple, but efficient way, so that it collects just the right amount of data that can benefit us and not an inch more. And you can still opt out of it. You could still opt out from this kind of capability. But, if it will give you a lot of possibilities, because if you can imagine this system that connects to your calendar, to your different habits of how you're using those devices, and then, of course, that is also related to your sort of health behaviors, to your health digital trackers, that really creates a very complex pictures in this kind of preventive, predictive diagnostics that I mentioned earlier, but also in generally in how you can improve your life on a daily basis, from the financial perspective to the security, from health to better work habits. I think that's where we are heading, to this kind of integrated, super intelligent platform that we'll all have. Our private AI filled with sensors that will kind of have a mild oversee of our lives and help us to lead those lives better.
So that sounds much better than a Orwellian nightmare.
I absolutely hope so, and that's the kind of direction I want to take my work and my projects forward, to try to keep this kind of positive, cautious but positive approach to use technology to improve our lives.
You've been listening to the Research for Good podcast. If you want to learn more about Lukasz's work, as well as other school of management research that focuses on making the world a better place, you can find the link in the episode description.